Sometimes tragedy doesn't begin with a scream. It begins with silence, with one message, one absence that stretches into forever. It was September 2014. In the small college town of Iowa City, the leaves were just starting to turn gold. 19-year-old Tao Zong, known to her friends as Sherry, sent a quick text to her roommate. She said she was taking a bus to Minnesota to visit a friend. She'd be gone just a few days. Nothing unusual, nothing alarming. But that simple text was the last anyone ever heard from her. A day passed, then another. Her phone went dark. No replies, no calls. Her professors noticed she hadn't shown up for class, and by the end of the week, her friends were frantic. Tao wasn't the type to disappear. She was responsible, disciplined, the kind of student who planned her days to the minute. And every Sunday, she called her parents back home in Dalian, China. That week, the call never came. When her friends filed a missing person report, police first assumed it was temporary, maybe a spontaneous trip, a misunderstanding. But very quickly, things stopped adding up. There was no record of any bus ticket under her name, no security footage showing her boarding any bus that day, her credit card, her bank account, her phone. All went silent at the exact same time. Officers searched her apartment. It looked just as she'd left it. Tidy, bed made, notebooks open on the desk. There was no sign of a struggle, no forced entry. But one thing was missing: her car. A gold 1997 Toyota Camry, registered in her name. It had vanished along with her. Investigators began tracing its GPS signal. The search led them to a quiet residential area just outside the city, Dolphin Lake Point Enclave, a cluster of lakeside apartments popular with foreign students. On September 26th, 2 weeks after Tao disappeared, officers arrived at the parking lot. There it was, a gold Camry, coated in dust, untouched for days. They broke the lock and lifted the trunk. What came out first was the smell, thick, heavy, decaying. Then, silence. Inside, a large black suitcase sat, wedged between old grocery bags. When they unzipped it, the room fell still. Curled tightly inside was the body of a young woman. Her head was wrapped in a white towel. Next to her lay a metal dumbbell, rusted at the edges. The suitcase tag was brand new. DNA confirmed what everyone feared. It was Tao Zong, 19 years old, a gifted student halfway around the world. And now, a murder victim, hidden in her own car. Who could have done this? And why? When detectives combed through the car, they found several small but crucial clues: a shattered cell phone, a receipt, and, tucked beneath the passenger seat, a printed airline itinerary with one name on it: Li Xiangnan. To Tao's friends, that name was immediately familiar. It wasn't random. It was her boyfriend. From that moment on, every path of the investigation led back to one person: the man who said he loved her, the man named Li Xiangnan. Li Xiangnan was 23 years old, a fellow Chinese student at the University of Iowa. He came from a well-off family in Wenzhou, Zhejiang province. Polite, well-dressed, and known among classmates as calm and ambitious. To outsiders, Li and Tao seemed like the perfect international couple. Both were bright, motivated, and shared the same dream of building a new life in the U.S. But behind that image, their relationship had begun to crumble. Friends later told investigators that Tao had tried to break up with Li weeks before her disappearance. She told them that he had become increasingly controlling, checking her phone, questioning her about male classmates, showing up unannounced at her apartment. Once, after an argument, he had followed her car for miles through the city. She told a friend she was scared but didn't want to make trouble. When detectives learned of this, they knew they had their first real lead. Police obtained the security footage from Tao's apartment complex. On the evening of September 6th, cameras caught her walking toward her car at 7:15 p.m., carrying a small duffel bag. Moments later, another figure appeared from the shadows of the parking lot. It was a man wearing a black hoodie, following her at a distance. Though the footage was grainy, his build and posture matched one person, Li Xiangnan. The next frame showed the two talking beside Tao's car. Then at 7:24, both doors opened. The car drove away. Tao was never seen alive again. Detectives began reconstructing Li's movements. Records showed that his phone was in the same cell tower range as Tao's until 10:30 that night. After that, both signals went dead. The next morning, Li showed up to class as if nothing had happened. He joked with classmates, turned in a paper, and even met with a study group at the library. But something about his behavior was off. In the days following Tao's disappearance, Li appeared nervous and withdrawn. He stopped attending lectures, avoided calls, and then, on September 18th, vanished from campus. By the time police issued a warrant to question him, Li had already left the United States. He boarded a flight from Chicago O'Hare to Beijing, then to his hometown in Wenzhou. He had left behind everything: his apartment, his car, and crucially, Tao's life. Investigators were furious. They were certain he was involved. The problem was, the United States had no extradition treaty with China. That meant even if Li confessed, bringing him back to face trial on American soil was almost impossible. Still, the detectives refused to give up. Working with the FBI and Chinese authorities, they built a meticulous case, piece by piece. The forensic report confirmed that Tao had died from blunt force trauma to the head. The metal dumbbell found in the suitcase was covered with traces of her blood and tissue. On its handle, investigators found a faint fingerprint, partial, but enough to identify. It matched Li Xiangnan. Inside Tao's apartment, police discovered further evidence of a struggle. On the floor near the bed was a small bloodstain. It had been wiped clean, but left enough DNA residue to match Tao. Neighbors later recalled hearing a loud thump that night, but dismissed it as students moving furniture. As the timeline formed, detectives believed Li had gone to Tao's apartment under the pretense of reconciliation. They argued. Things escalated. In a burst of rage, Li struck her repeatedly with the dumbbell, killing her. He then wrapped her head in a towel, placed her body in a suitcase, and drove her car to the lakeside parking lot. After hiding the evidence, he calmly walked back to his apartment, cleaned up, and began preparing for his escape. It was cold, calculated, and terrifyingly methodical. Meanwhile, in China, Tao's parents were devastated. Their daughter had gone to America to study, a dream they had sacrificed everything for. When they received the call from U.S. police confirming her death, her mother collapsed. Her father couldn't even speak. All they could ask was, why? When Chinese authorities learned that Li was the main suspect, public outrage erupted. The case was widely reported across Chinese media as the Iowa student murder. People were horrified by the brutality and by the possibility that Li might walk free simply because of a legal loophole. For months, Chinese investigators conducted their own inquiry. They gathered evidence from the U.S. through diplomatic channels, photos, DNA reports, testimonies, and digital data. Step by step, they reconstructed the same conclusion the Americans had reached. Li was the killer. In 2015, Chinese police finally arrested him in Wenzhou. News of the arrest spread quickly across both countries. Reporters described him as emotionless during questioning, speaking calmly, occasionally even smiling. He didn't deny knowing Tao. He admitted they'd argued, but claimed her death was an accident. According to him, she had fallen and hit her head. But the evidence told a different story. Her injuries were consistent with multiple blows, not a single fall. The suitcase, the towel, the attempt to conceal the body, all showed deliberate intent. Li's accident claim didn't hold up. By 2016, the case was officially handed over to the Chinese court system. It was the first time in years that a murder committed on American soil would be prosecuted in China. The trial drew massive attention from both governments and international media. It wasn't just about one man's guilt. It was about justice across borders. The trial began in Wenzhou Intermediate People's Court in May 2016, nearly 2 years after Tao Zong's body was found. By that time, the story had become one of the most talked about international murder cases involving a Chinese citizen overseas. Reporters from Beijing, Shanghai, and even foreign outlets filled the courtroom. The public wanted answers and justice. Li Xiangnan walked into court in a plain gray sweatshirt, thinner than before, but expressionless. His parents were present, sitting silently in the back. Across the room sat Tao's grieving family, her mother clutching a framed photo of her daughter, unable to lift her eyes toward the man accused of killing her. The prosecutors laid out their case with brutal precision. They showed the timeline reconstructed from both U.S. and Chinese investigations. Li and Tao met in 2013 as international students at the University of Iowa. Their relationship soured by mid-2014. Tao told friends she wanted to end it. On September 6, 2014, Li visited her apartment under the pretense of talking things through. At approximately 8:30 p.m., neighbors heard a heavy impact and faint screaming. Cell tower data showed both of their phones moving together to the parking lot. At 9:14 p.m., Li's phone signal disappeared. Tao never used hers again. The prosecution presented the physical evidence, the blood pattern in her apartment, the fingerprints on the dumbbell, and the suitcase fibers that matched his luggage back in his dorm. They also showed that after Tao's death, Li cleaned the apartment, drove her car to the lake, left her body in the trunk, and returned home on foot. He then calmly withdrew $1,000 in cash, deleted messages from his phone, and booked a one-way flight to China the next morning. The courtroom was silent as these details were read aloud. Li's defense attorney didn't deny that Tao had died during their encounter, but he argued that it wasn't murder. According to the defense, Li had gone to apologize and reconcile. They argued that Tao became upset, threw something at him, and in the struggle that followed, she accidentally fell and struck her head. Overcome with panic, Li tried to hide the body, fearing deportation and public shame. But the forensic experts dismantled that claim piece by piece. The blows to Tao's skull were from multiple impacts, not a fall. The towel around her head was tightly wrapped, suggesting an attempt to conceal the bleeding. The act of placing her in a suitcase and hiding the body showed clear consciousness of guilt. When asked why he left the country, Li simply said, "I was scared. I wanted to go home." It was the only moment in the trial when his voice wavered. Tao's parents listened quietly, their hands clasped. For them, it wasn't about revenge. It was about dignity, to ensure that their daughter's death would not be forgotten, and that justice would not be lost in translation between two countries. During closing arguments, the prosecutor's voice rose. This was not an accident. This was a violent killing, driven by jealousy, control, and fear of rejection. The defendant struck the victim multiple times, concealed her body, and fled the scene. Every step he took was deliberate. Then, for the first time, the court played Tao's last known footage, that grainy video of her walking to her car, unaware that death was waiting in the shadows. Her mother began to cry, clutching the photo to her chest. The defense asked for leniency, pointing out that Li had turned himself in to Chinese authorities after his return, though in truth, he had only confessed once pressure mounted from both governments. They requested a lighter sentence, citing his cooperation and remorse. But the judge wasn't convinced. On July 29, 2016, after hours of deliberation, the court delivered its verdict. Li Xiangnan was found guilty of intentional homicide. He was sentenced to life imprisonment, with the possibility of parole after 20 years. The courtroom erupted, reporters typing furiously, cameras flashing. Tao's father closed his eyes and whispered a single word: justice. Her mother wept quietly beside him. It wasn't the justice they had dreamed of, not in the land where their daughter had died. But it was justice, nonetheless. For them, the verdict meant that her story would not end in silence. After the sentencing, U.S. authorities praised the cooperation between both countries. The case was hailed as a rare example of cross-border justice, proving that distance and diplomacy could not erase responsibility. But for many observers, the story also revealed the deep gaps that still exist in international law. Gaps that can leave victims' families waiting for years. In the months that followed, Li appealed his sentence, claiming that the punishment was too harsh. The court rejected it. He remains imprisoned in Zhejiang province, where he will likely spend most of his life behind bars. Tao's family later established a small scholarship fund in her name at her university, a quiet tribute to her dreams. Every year, it supports one international student from China, someone who, like Tao, came to America to chase knowledge and a future. The tragedy left an indelible mark on both nations. In Iowa City, a memorial plaque stands near the campus library, where Tao used to study. It reads simply, "In memory of Tao Zong, may truth and kindness outlive violence." For many who followed the case, it wasn't just about crime. It was about how fragile safety can be, how love can twist into control, and how justice sometimes travels thousands of miles before it finally arrives. Years later, people still visit her online memorial page. They leave messages in English and Chinese, short, heartfelt notes from strangers. Some write, "Rest in peace, Tao." Others say, "We didn't know you, but we remember you, and maybe, in the end, that's what matters most." That she's remembered, not just as a victim, but as a young woman who crossed oceans chasing hope, whose story reminds us how easily the human heart can break and how fiercely it can demand truth. In the months after the trial, the story of Tao Zong and Li Xiangnan continued to ripple through both nations. It wasn't just a murder case anymore. It had become a conversation about justice, culture, and the hidden pressures facing young people studying abroad. In China, the media dissected every detail. Major news outlets called it a tragedy born of obsession. Others focused on the deeper issue, the emotional isolation many students face when they leave home for a foreign country. Tao and Li had both been thousands of miles away from family, navigating a new language, a new culture, and the overwhelming expectations to succeed. For some, that distance becomes freedom. For others, it becomes a quiet storm. Commentators described Li as a man consumed by control, unable to handle rejection, terrified of losing face, and unwilling to let go. Psychologists pointed out that his behavior showed classic signs of possessive jealousy, a kind of emotional dependency that often hides beneath the surface of relationships until it turns violent. But what shocked people most was how ordinary it all seemed. There were no warning signs loud enough for anyone to intervene, no police reports, no formal complaints, just small moments. Text messages, arguments, unease, that only gained meaning after it was too late. At the University of Iowa, faculty and students held a candlelight vigil in Tao's memory. Hundreds gathered under the autumn sky, holding small white candles that flickered in the wind. Some who barely knew her cried openly. A professor read a short speech about resilience and remembrance. Then, a close friend stepped forward and said, "She was always smiling, always kind. I still expect her to walk through the door." It was a moment of unity, and a painful reminder of the quiet vulnerabilities that can exist even among the brightest, most promising students. Back in China, Tao's parents avoided public attention. They declined interviews, choosing to grieve in private. A year after the verdict, they visited her grave for the first time. Her father laid down a bouquet of lilies and whispered, "You're home now." They said little else. Yet their silence spoke volumes. For them, closure didn't mean peace. It meant carrying the truth for the rest of their lives, knowing that their daughter's name had become both a symbol of justice and a warning. Meanwhile, the case left a deep mark on international law enforcement. The cooperation between the U.S. and Chinese authorities became a rare model of coordination without an extradition treaty. Forensic files, digital evidence, and testimonies were exchanged across borders, something that had seldom happened before. The collaboration showed that even when legal systems differ, human justice can still find a path. For investigators on both sides, it was personal. Many of the detectives who worked on the case were parents themselves. They spoke later about how the image of that small suitcase and what it held haunted them for years. One Iowa officer said in an interview, "You never forget a case like this. You carry it with you. Every time I see a foreign student walking alone at night, I think of her." In classrooms across the U.S., professors began discussing the case in criminal justice courses, using it as an example of cross-national cooperation and the complexities of prosecuting crimes across borders. Students debated whether Li should have faced trial in the United States, where the crime occurred, or in China, where justice was ultimately served. There were no easy answers. Yet, in a quiet way, Tao's story began changing things. Universities started expanding mental health programs for international students. Some created orientation sessions about relationship safety and emotional well-being. The tragedy sparked conversations about loneliness, cultural pressure, and the invisible struggles that can accompany life far from home. As the years passed, Li faded from headlines. He serves his life sentence in a medium-security prison in Zhejiang, spending his days in routine labor and silence. Reports say he rarely speaks of the crime, keeping to himself, reading occasionally, sometimes writing letters that are never sent. Whether he feels remorse, no one truly knows. But the world he left behind continues to remember. For those who followed the story, the details linger. The bus trip that never happened. The suitcase waiting in the trunk. The silence of a phone that would never ring again. True crime enthusiasts in America often revisit the case on forums and podcasts, calling it one of the most chilling yet overlooked murders involving an international student. Listeners, especially those who studied abroad themselves, describe an eerie familiarity, that feeling of being far from home, of trusting someone too deeply, of realizing too late that love can become dangerous when control replaces care. In China, the story has taken on a moral dimension. It's taught in social psychology courses and discussed in documentaries as a study in obsession, how fear of losing face can drive people to irreversible acts. Some say Li's crime reflected a deeper cultural flaw, the belief that possession is a form of love. But if there's any lesson to be taken from this tragedy, it isn't just about one man's crime. It's about the fragile thread that connects love, control, and violence, and how quickly it can snap. In the end, Tao's life was brief, but her story endures because it forces us to look closer, to question how we define love, and to see the red flags we often ignore until they turn fatal. Today, on the University of Iowa campus, students still pass by her memorial. Most of them weren't there when it happened. Many don't even know the full story, but some stop for a moment, look at her name, and feel something. That faint chill of empathy, of shared humanity. It's said that true justice doesn't erase pain, it only ensures that pain isn't forgotten. And perhaps that's what Tao's story has done. It has given a voice to silence. It has reminded us that behind every case, every headline, there's a real person. A daughter, a friend, a dream that never got to finish its journey.